Welcome to episode 66 of the Cash Flow Connections podcast. The topic for today is creating and nurturing relationships with people of influence. Today, we're going to talk about something that we haven't really talked about on the show. In fact, it's something that isn't really talked about much at all, but it's an underlying theme behind virtually every conversation we've had on the program. It has been said many times that real estate is a team sport. It's especially true when you compare it to something like stocks, especially day trading, where you can make a lot of money just sitting in front of a computer. You don't really need a network to help you solve a lot of problems. Well, with real estate, it's really the opposite of that. And I think that's been a reoccurring theme throughout many of these episodes. We haven't really taken the time to talk about relationships, how to create them, how to nurture them, especially when it comes to having relationships with people that are influential, key people of influence. As you can tell from this conversation, you actually don't need a huge quantity of those types of relationships. You need quality. But if you can have just a couple of people in your life that have played the game and have won successfully and also see a bit of themselves in you, they can supercharge your career, and it can completely change your learning curve, and it can 10x or 100x what you normally would be able to achieve on your own. So that's really why I want to take the time to look at some of those relationships and how our guests were able to facilitate them. Speaking of that, our guests are Ryan and Jamie Smith of Elevation Capital. They are the sponsors of our currently available fund, which is a mobile home park and self-storage offering. I have spent a lot of time with them, and every time we're together, some fascinating story always comes up involving them and some pretty remarkable individuals. This isn't a result of them just name dropping or even seeking out those types of relationships specifically. As you're going to hear in the conversation, it's a result of really being at the right place at the right time and being an enthusiastic person that inspires other people and genuinely cares about helping other people succeed. And when I say being at the right place at the right time, it's not a matter of luck. It's a matter of doing things that put you in a position to succeed. You're going to be surrounded by other people doing the same thing. This can actually lead to some really interesting situations and relationships. That's the type of stuff that people are just absolutely drawn to. Being the type of person that inspires others is magnetic, and everyone wants to be a part of that. Now, one thing I didn't get to discuss actually during the interview, but if you're interested in this topic, I actually do have a great book on this topic, which is called The Charisma Myth. It is one of my favorite books that I've read in 2018. If you are interested in networking, or if you're doing a lot of these in-person meetings, or if you just want to improve your interactions in the workplace, The Charisma Myth is a great book on this topic, which really isn't covered that much. I don't think I've mentioned it on the show before, but if you're interested, make sure to take a look. In this episode, we discuss how Ryan was able to present at a crowd of more than 10,000 and how that experience allowed him to develop some relationships with several noteworthy individuals. We're also going to talk about being a thought leader, how putting forth a lot of effort towards this can result in some great opportunities. One of our guests, Jamie, is the author of a book on renting mobile home parks and RVs, and this actually also can help facilitate that and also nurture those relationships. We're also going to discuss taking actions that aren't scalable in order to maintain relationships, especially for key individuals. This is something that you should take very seriously, especially if you're just getting started. The way to build and maintain relationships is not to Command Shift B, BCC every single person in your database and say, hey, it's been a while since we've caught up, let's connect soon. That's not it. If you start doing things like sending handwritten notes, especially thank you notes if anyone helps you out, or even calling people directly, those things actually tend to make a much more valuable impact on someone. And if you're just getting started, you have the time to do this stuff. So make sure to make time, because that's a great way to spend your 5-10 minutes that it takes to do that. Of course, if you're going to make it to the Intelligent Investors Real Estate Conference, you're going to be able to see Ryan speak there. He's actually going to be presenting one of our keynotes for the event. If you haven't already gotten your tickets, make sure to go to intelligentinvestors2018.com and grab them right now, because the event is right around the corner. And if you're interested in investing in our currently available fund, which is again sponsored by Ryan and Jamie, the two guests of this program, go to cashflowconnections.com, create an account, and we'd love to help you out. We'd love to have you be part of the CFC family. All right, hope you enjoyed the episode. How's it going, everyone? Our guests for today are Ryan and Jamie Smith of Elevation Capital Group. These two bring with them more than 2.5 decades of combined experience in market evaluation, property analysis, management systems, due diligence, and finance. They co-manage multiple investment funds, which specialize in investing in mobile home parks and participate in the ownership and or management of more than 20,000 mobile home park lots. Jamie is the author of a highly reviewed book on investing in mobile home parks, and she has spoken at numerous conferences on the topic. And Ryan's ability to communicate effectively has propelled him to be a featured commentator alongside the likes of Mayor Rudy Giuliani, Colin Powell, and several other notable individuals, many of which we're going to talk about today, actually. But regardless of that, Ryan and Jamie, really an honor to have you guys on. Thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thrilled to do it.
So, yeah, and it's interesting because we've had a lot of conversations over the years, and really the point of this particular interview is that a lot of your conversations, a lot of the stories that you guys have been involved in have been pretty incredible in terms of the amount of influence you've been able to have over so many people's lives with many of the live events that you've done, but also the amount of influential people that you guys have bumped shoulders with over the years. And before we kind of jump into that topic and trying to discuss the best ways to facilitate that and the best ways to grow those relationships, just give a brief introduction about your background before you guys started on this incredible endeavor in the mobile home park business, prior to that, and then just taking us up to speed. And if you want to just start us off, Jamie, because I know that you haven't been a guest on this program before, but I know that a lot of listeners are going to be very interested in your story.
Well, thank you. I'd be thrilled to tell you a little bit about the startup in the background, and I know Ryan will probably want to add to it. But I think probably like most of your listeners and like yourself, we saw that there was something out there that we wanted to build that we hadn't done yet. And so we started very simply in single family residential investing, quickly saw that that wasn't going to take us where we needed to go from a scalability standpoint. So although we had acquired 20, 30 single family homes to get started, we quickly began analyzing different opportunities within the multi-unit, multi-family sector, as well as other commercial real estate opportunities. And so, through that analysis, very, very quickly, we're able to see some pathways that we wanted to go down. And mobile home parks was something that we went into very heavily, and we did that with our own resources. And it was an exciting experience to do it A to Z, front to back, fully integrated, everything from the cold calls to identify the property to handling all the due diligence, personally overseeing property management, acquisitions, et cetera. So it's been an exciting path. And then from there, we've grown it into what it is today, where we've aggregated, properties across two sectors, which is the storage facility space as well as the mobile home communities. And we've really enjoyed that and look forward to continuing to grow it.
Yeah, I appreciate you going to that. And, we've had Ryan as a guest on the program before, and it did sound like a lot of people were drawn into single family because it's what most people are familiar with. But you mentioned 20 or 30. I have seen people go up to, upwards of 100. But at a certain point, you realize, man, the economies of scale just isn't there to really take advantage of many of the benefits of investing in commercial real estate, most notably the financing side of things. You can make just as much money as you can doing one deal of commercial than you can of doing 50 deals of single family. But the overhead and the admin is just really challenging. So definitely a familiar story in terms of that. And Ryan, did you want to add anything to that? Obviously, you've been a guest on the show before, but we've obviously acquired a lot of listeners since your last appearance. So just give us a brief overview, and we can jump into kind of the actual operating of some of these businesses, et cetera.
Yeah, so I would mirror what Jamie said, but to go even before, or to kind of take the story back even before where she kind of on-ramped it, we both came from entrepreneurial families that were in the real estate business. I had started a software company and had made some money from that as a teenager, and then in my early 20s. And Jamie had a pretty significant experience in property management and executing and managing a P&L and driving performance at an asset, a pretty large asset actually, just off campus for UCF. So we were uniquely, I would say, resourced and skilled in different ways that were complementary. So Jamie and I, when we met, started dating, we talked right off about building something and kind of bringing our respective talents to bear on a business model. And so it's been not only a great marriage, literally, but also from a business standpoint. And so then that's when we started looking at single family housing. We accumulated a portfolio, and took the path that we took. But it's been a lot of fun.
So pretty early on in your endeavors towards the mobile home park business, I know that you guys started doing live events, and I wanted to hear a little bit about, how you were first introduced to presenting and how this has become a significant portion of your business over the years, even though I think originally it was something that maybe, I know, Ryan, that you were a little bit hesitant about. I was interested if you could share those first stories about, first presenting in front of large audiences, and it comes with the takeaways and whether or not you enjoyed that experience or not.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And so I'll be absolutely candid about it. There are people who are very intentional and strategic and tactical about, the way they would like to get into, presenting and speaking. And for lack of a better term, they kind of want the spotlight and the stage. I was the polar opposite. I had to basically be hogtied and dragged on the stage against my will. So I had a software company that catered to real estate investors. And it was a unique story that I had built the software program for my dad, who was a real estate investor, thought it could be helpful to him, ended up having more than 100,000 users around the globe. So it was a unique story that, this teenage kid built the software application that was geared towards real estate investors. And so I received an invitation. I want to say I was in my early 20s, I think right around 22, 23, to speak at a conference in Las Vegas. And I was really reticent against any public speaking, really shy, kind of introverted. So anyway, I received this request from one of the companies I distributed my software to, and they said, yeah, we'd like you to speak. And so at that point, I had kind of challenged myself to, if conceptually or mentally, I thought it was a good decision, but emotionally, I didn't want to do it, that I would make the hard choice, the right choice, despite, my discomfort. So at that point, I said, you know what, I need to get over it. So I begrudgingly said yes. So I said yes. And then I said, well, if you don't mind, how many people will be there? And they said, well, at least 1,000. And I think there was something like 1,500 or some odd people there. And I said, I about fell out of my chair. And then I said, well, and how long do you want me to speak for? And they said, well, if you can go 2 to 3 hours, that would be,
right.
That would be ideal. I'm like 2 to 3. I struggle with 2 to 3 minutes, 2 to 3 hours. So anyway, so I did it. I didn't sleep very well for weeks and days leading up to it. And lo and behold, I did it and got great feedback. There was, a bunch of notable people. There was, I think, Robert Kiyosaki, Ron LeGrand. There was a bunch of notable industry people there. And I finished, I think there were 10 speakers or so. And I was the second highest rated speaker there, which is, there must have been some kind of ballot error or something. But anyway.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I was shocked, but I think it was just pity. But ultimately, that gave me some confidence from there, and that it was an incredibly uncomfortable, terrifying experience for the first go round.
That's pretty remarkable. I mean, 2 to 3 hours, especially to get high ratings, is pretty remarkable. If I do a self-hosted or self-guested podcast episode that's 10 or 20 minutes, it's a ton of content. So that's pretty interesting. I mean, you already mentioned Robert Kiyosaki, Ron LeGrand. I'm sure that a lot of listeners are familiar with those names. A lot of the stories that I've heard both of you guys have been involved in have involved some pretty influential people. I mean, first of all, what do you attribute this to? I mean, obviously that situation was kind of unique in the sense that you were asked to speak at this large event. But since then, I know that you guys have curated a lot of relationships, basically on your own. Where do you think a lot of that comes from, and how do you think that factors in terms of facilitating those relationships?
Jamie, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, absolutely. I think when you first asked the question, the thing that really comes to mind to me is, the word momentum, or the concept of water joins the moving stream. I think something about Ryan and I that we've had pointed out to us by some of these figures that you referenced is that we have a sense of urgency. And it's not just an aimless sense of urgency. I think there's a key difference there in terms of we've always tried to be disciplined about really casting the vision, where we're headed or where we're headed in this season. And then we usually just lace up our shoes and we move, not recklessly, but with a significant amount of urgency and intention, which creates quite a bit of momentum. And I know that a lot of these folks, they reference when they see us, they comment on our urgency and how intentional we are. And then a lot of times we'll hear that we remind them of themselves. So I think there's that connection or that immediate camaraderie in that some of those traits that they seem to be recognizing in us were things that they feel propelled them to where they are. which then really just creates a bridge to relationship and commonality.
Yeah, that is
Well said.
very, very true. I really like that, especially the part about the urgency. That's one of those things that people want to be around things that are heading up. I mean, if there's a rocket ship taking off, everyone wants to come on it. And so when you basically say, like, this is where we're headed, you can see people that are interested in, bettering the lives of others and also bettering their own sphere of influence. They're very attracted to that. That's actually something that is really critical. And I also think sharing your goals with people really influences that and really can expedite that. So when you're starting to share your vision with them and they want to be a part of that vision, I can definitely see that. Ryan, did you want to add anything to that as well?
No, I think Jamie said it very well. I like that saying. We've always used that water joins a moving stream. So I think the only part that I would add is sometimes as it pertains to networking or relationships and key relationships, there's a sense where it could also be used as an excuse from the standpoint of saying, well, if I only had a person who could do X, then I could do Y, or it's kind of cause and effect, rather than, to Jamie's point, we've always been, regardless of who, we're going to do it with, she and I are going to plow ahead and build and grow and innovate and, make things happen. And then those who are part of it can come along. And by the way, there's plenty of seats on the boat or whatever vehicle you want to use as an analogy. Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of seats. We're open for accommodating, but we're going to move regardless. That's all what Jamie just said. So nothing new, but I think she said it really well.
Yeah, agreed. The live events, it sounds to me like that was something that happened relatively early on and now is still to this day is a big portion of your business. How many live events do you think that you've done over the years, including sponsorships and exhibits, et cetera? I know it's a significant number.
Well, yeah, and early on, with regard to live events, we weren't producing them or putting them on. We were somewhat of anomalies. Jamie and I were, in our early mid-20s buying mobile home parks when, today that's avant-garde and kind of neat. Back then, it was like, come watch these young kids who don't know what they're doing. They're buying mobile home parks. Let's see how it ends. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's kind of but it turned out really well. But because we were somewhat of an anomaly, we had a lot of groups ask us to come present and speak, and so the formats constantly changed. But we were basically communicating the merits of mobile home parks and why people should consider them from an investment perspective. We didn't have funds at that time. We weren't. There was no real ulterior motive there. It was just more or less communicating the merits of the space. But to answer the second part of the question, and I would say we've done hundreds, probably several hundred different presentations to different formats over the years, I would say.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable. So in the last, let's say 12, 15 years, hundreds is the answer. And that's that's so significant. And I can obviously relate to that. I mean, even in the time that I've been investing in mobile home parks, starting in 2011, 2012, originally when I was explaining the benefits of investing in the vehicle, it was really about explaining the entire business model because people had not considered it before. And now it's really, it's quite competitive in terms of people understand the big picture thesis. It's a matter of who can out operate each other, which is totally fine. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we're partnered together because we think that you guys have that expertise. But it's interesting. It's fascinating the way that has changed so much from trying to create a paradigm shift so that people would consider investing in mobile home parks to basically saying, well, obviously that's a great idea. Now we got to figure out who the best is in the business. So
Agreed.
Pretty remarkable there. So I remember hearing a story about one of the really large events you guys had, and I don't remember the details, but I was hoping to discuss it on the program today. So could you take us back to, I believe you threw a large event a couple of years ago, some of the key takeaways, some of the highlights of that event, and if you think that model is something that you plan on doing again, particularly the large conference type of structure?
Yeah, it's a good question. And Jamie will definitely want to chime in. That was quite the experience. But yeah, we did an event in Boise, Idaho, and I want to say 2012 off the top of my head. It was a lot of work, a lot of effort. It worked well, but it was somewhat of a new approach. So a lot of, the bigger format seminars that have been out there in the past, they're basically glorified pitch fests where it's you use a big draw, you bring people in, and then you just sell us knickknacks and things. Right. And that's not something that interested us in any regard. So our hope was that we could bring people to the stage that we had relationship with, Rudy Giuliani, Ben Stein, Steve Forbes, some pretty neat people, bring them to the stage, And, their only task was to share something of value based on their experience with the audience. And then the outcome was that, obviously ticket sales supported the economics and some of these things, but the hope was that we were able to walk out with relationships and be able to connect with people we otherwise wouldn't have. And that has absolutely happened. We actually, to this day, have a number of closely held relationships that came from just that one event. The second part of the question, will we do it again? Jamie and I have talked about it. If we ever did an event like that or similar to that, it would be with the lens of education and equipping and connecting. We just are very much against the whole concept of creating an off-putting environment that the sole purpose is pitching products, books, wares, courses, those kind of things.
Totally agree.
So we'd be open to it, but there's no plans now beyond. We're starting an annual investor conference that we're going to host that our investors can go to, and then we're going to allow a limited number of those who are not currents to attend if there's excess capacity. And we'll probably start that in the spring of next year, I think in April in Newport Beach, California. I think we'll be the first one and probably do that on an annual basis, but that'll be heavily content, pragmatic, not itchy in any way.
Yep, I relate to that. And you're also going to be speaking at the upcoming Intelligent Investors Real Estate Conference, which is November 10th to the 11th in Marina del Rey. I have obviously seen you speak many times. I understand that the content is really the thing. I mean, the thing is, there's so much amazing educational content available on the internet. If people are going to fly somewhere, they're basically doing it for a combination of the in-person experience, but also the networking component. So if you have people fly in and you are really just there to pitch them on cruises or books and tapes, I mean, you're a decades behind the times. And I think that's really, that shift is taking place, and it's going to be really advantageous for investors because a lot of interesting live events are going to come of this, because really interesting stuff happens when you put all those people in the same room together.
Agreed.
So I'm definitely looking forward to hearing more about that event when that does come up. You mentioned Rudy Giuliani and Steve Forbes. How did you originally get those relationships? How did you originally get introduced to them and facilitate that so you were able to have them come speak at your own conference?
I would say it's just proximity. We had seen them over the years, and I've spoken at a number of events that they also spoke at. And so, we'd be together in the green room, and, month after month or year over year, we'd see each other and it'd be, hey, Ryan, or hey, Zig Ziglar, or these just great people. And there's a lot of community that kind of naturally evolved. But I'd say for a point that, your listener might be able to take away, I think proximity, face to face, but being in the same space does quite a bit. And to use actually a story from Steve Forbes, and this is fairly well known, I think, but his father, they were not wealthy at all, but his father invested a significant portion of his family's wealth, which was very minimal, into buying a suit. And every day would go down to New York City and sit, and I believe it was the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and he would get a newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, sit out, read the newspaper, sit in the lobby. And that actually was the basis for Forbes today. He met the guy, because of proximity and an assumption that they were relative peers, there was enough commonality by at least assumption. And that was the basis for Forbes. So I think proximity does quite a bit.
Wow, that's interesting. I've never heard that story, but it is one of those things where if you're in the same area, if you're constantly rubbing shoulders, if your name keeps coming up, the familiarity is there. And it's like, well, who are we going to get to talk at our conference? Well, Ryan, we've talked to him a couple times. He seems like he knows what he's doing. So that's how a lot of those relationships are facilitated. I would say that at least 80% of my business is based on a few key relationships that I made early on by going to networking events. And I can tell you, if you guys are planning on doing that as a source of business, the key, you will be shocked at how little you get the first networking event you go to. But if you continue to go to those networking events and the quality of the attendees is high, after years, you will also be shocked at how incredibly powerful going to those events can be. It has to be focused. It has to be the right group of people. But if you continue to go and you continue to add value to those peers, it will come around pretty quickly. And that's kind of an interesting segue into another question I wanted to ask you. And Jamie, maybe you can take the lead on this one, which is about philanthropy. And I know this has been an important part of your life for quite some time. I wanted to hear, some of the ways you guys give back, and also some of the relationships that you've ended up creating just as a result of focusing your efforts towards philanthropic activities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll answer the question in part by bringing forward the word that Ryan just mentioned, which was proximity. being generous or being involved in philanthropic efforts is something that is a part of, Ryan and I, our upbringing, a part of who we are as a team. And so it's always been a desire of ours. So we've always been intentional in the way that we've chosen to give or be in what might be a generous community. There's an organization that we're involved with called Generous Giving, which is a very unique organization in that it never has any sort of financial ask. The goal is just to generate philanthropic efforts or a generous community. And I think that common thread drew us in, and unexpectedly, we met so many wonderful people that we probably wouldn't have met in other environments, but because of that common interest, and we were in the same space, so the proximity component, and then naturally, you just become drawn to one another because of that common interest or area of focus. So it's something that's been very exciting part of what we do. And again, to use another word that I used earlier, is just being intentional about it. So I think oftentimes there's a concept of interest or a concept of giving back, and something that we've opted to do in our hometown, in our community. We've decided to participate or basically initiate what we call giving groups. So there's where there's a group of 12, or there's another group where there's 6 couples that amounts to 12 individuals. And collectively on an annual basis, we join forces and select someone or an organization within our community that we give to in a very hands-on fashion. We process it and consider it the gift like an investment. So we consider the recipients very carefully, but it's just something that really is absolutely life-giving. And to tie it back to the business side of things, it's often a huge motivator there as well, because we know the more that we build, we also look at our employees as beneficiaries of our efforts. And so we don't take that responsibility lightly, but we also are aware that the better we build our business, there's excess proceeds available that we can be more philanthropic with or be more intentional in a generous way.
Yeah, and I really like what you said there about basically assuming the responsibility that you have with the employees that work with you. Mm-hmm. And that is something that the first time I was able to pay someone significantly to allow them to help grow my business, I realized how huge of a responsibility that is. If someone is relying on you as a source of income, for some people, it's too much of a responsibility because they understand that their life is in your hands, and it's very significant. But at the same time, if you enjoy that increased responsibility, it's a great feeling to be able to help someone pursue their financial career by something that you created. So it's pretty remarkable what you guys have done. And again, I appreciate you sharing that. One of the things that I've heard Ryan talk about previously was the relationship with Brian Don. This is someone who is the principal of the self-storage side of the fund that we currently are partnering on. And this guy is one of the complete legends of the industry, and I found the story about you guys getting connected originally fascinating. So I was wondering if you could share with the listeners how that ended up happening and under what circumstances you ended up meeting and then eventually partnering with him.
Yeah, so I guess I can take that. And I second everything that Jamie just said. There's actually, if we have time, there's a neat story that came out of one of those giving groups that might be worth sharing in a minute, but it's pretty interesting. But with regards to Brian Don, to make it short and succinct, I spoke at a conference in Boston in my, I want to say early mid-20s, formed a friendship with a guy who was an attendant who's from Newport Beach. And anyway, he was in the White House with Ronald Reagan, and just a really neat guy. There was something about him, and we connected right off the bat. We were fast friends. And, he was, I believe at the time, Jamie and I were in our, call it early mid-20s, and he was, I think, late 50s or so. So generations apart, but at the same time, there's just a lot of commonality. We really liked each other. So over the years, he watched us continue to build over many years. We continued to buy and build and grow, and he just watched from a distance. And, we saw each other regularly and communicated. But at some point, I want to say it was right around 2004, 2005, maybe even 2006, he reached out. He said, I'm impressed with what you guys are doing. I really want to introduce you to a good friend of mine. His name's Brian Don. And of course, we had no idea at the time. And Jamie and I had a nice portfolio that we had built. And I think at the time, this gentleman whose name's Rush said, my friend Brian, I think at the time he had something like 50 to 55,000 units that he operated. And so Jamie and I, being far less than that number, were astounded. And so Resh said, hey, if you'd like, I can set up a meeting. We said, great. So Resh called back not too long afterwards. He said, okay, well, Brian doesn't usually do these things, but he's doing it as a favor to me. He can meet tomorrow night for dinner in Newport Beach. And I think at the time we were, on the East Coast, as memory serves me. We were on the East Coast and we were having this conversation with him the night before. So basically, we would have to book a flight the next morning, fly across. I think the only flight was to LAX at the time. Then we had to drive down. And basically, we came straight from the airport. We flew across the country, went straight to the airport to dinner to meet with a guy that we'd never met before. So we show up, we have dinner, and we're just thrilled with the prospect of meeting somebody like this. Because one other thing you should probably know is Jamie and I, in our personal spheres, our parents, friends, and family, we didn't really have anybody doing what we were doing. So we didn't know anybody to go talk to or ask or connect with. So we had to fly from East Coast to California to have dinner with a guy in the hopes that it was profitable, or that there was some mutual benefit that came from it. So the whole meal, it was really funny. We came out to learn something and to glean. And the whole meal, Brian just asked us question after question after question. And, I was sitting here like, by the end of the meal, I had done all the talking, telling him about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And at the end of the meal, he said, he's like, I'm really intrigued with what you guys are doing and how you're doing it. And I'm impressed. So he said, for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to stay, not getting up, I'm not leaving. And I'll stay and answer any question that you have as long as I'm knowledgeable. And so thankfully, and this is, I guess, part of it, know what you need. And basically be ready to ask the right person the right question. You need to have that question. So I had a question. And I asked him the question, basically, how did you scale your business to the size it was? And that's a benign question, but he actually took out a napkin at the table and drew a structure that I had never seen before, had no knowledge of. And so on the cover of our website, there's a picture of a train that basically a train track that goes 100 miles in the distance. And the reason I picked that picture is very intentional. Before this meeting with Brian, I knew I was on the right track, but it was as if dense fog covered the track. So I trusted I wasn't going to go off a cliff, thought I was on the right track, but couldn't see with great visibility and clarity where I was going. But after this meal, that 30 minutes, that one question and his answer, it blew all the fog off the track. I can see 100 miles in the future. Now I just had to execute. And it was one of the most energizing experiences. And he's still to this day is shocked that we were energized by it. He's like, all I did was answer a question, but it was the grounds, because in short, what we did is we took his answer, we actually implemented it. And Jamie is about the best that I've ever seen at this, but she would handwrite letters to him telling him of our progress and what we were doing and that we were good stewards of the investment he made in us. And, just kind of shared our growth based on that chance encounter. When he got the first letter, signifying what we had done with the investment of his advice and feedback, he called us and said, when can we get together again? We had dinner again in Newport Beach, and we've been quite close ever since. So that's probably more than you wanted to know, but those are kind of the high points.
No, yeah, that's incredible. And actually, there's plenty of details in there that I wasn't aware of before. It's pretty remarkable. There's two things I think are interesting there. Number one, that the right person giving you the right advice at the right time it can be so powerful. But what is much more powerful is, I'm sure, his reaction to when you sent him the letter regarding your progress. That was probably shocking to him, because as much as we'd like to believe that if he had just told any one of us that same information that he told you, we'd all be in your position. The reality is there's plenty of books out there. There's plenty of educational content out there about financial well-being, financial markets, making the right moves at the right time. And the lack of action is really the cause for most people's challenges. And so when people take action, it's like a breath of fresh air for those that are really dedicated to that. And I think that's really going back to what we originally said about the people that you want to surround yourself by and how people are interested in momentum and urgency. It's really compelling because it's very unique and not very common. So definitely interesting there. And I do want to go back to that relationships you developed from generous giving. I mean, we could definitely can maneuver through the rest of the conversation, but I do want to discuss that because I think that giving is so much more powerful from an emotional standpoint. It's probably 10x any income. It's, if you make $1,000, it feels like you're giving away $10,000. Like, and the benefit is just overwhelmingly positive. Go back to that and let's hear about that relationship and that story that you were thinking of unfolding.
Sure. And I'll give you an example of it as well, and something that Jamie did. But in short, let me also start by submitting to your listeners that I don't think a person that you would deem generous would ever consider themselves generous. So Jamie and I, we aspire to be more generous than we currently are. So, we're definitely not there yet. So it's a process, and we're on the continuum, hopefully, but I don't think we would proclaim ourselves as quote unquote generous people, but we're definitely inspired by those who are and strive to be more ourselves. But one of the things that, generosity, sometimes there's a way that people view philanthropic activities and generosity at large, where it's your business is where you kind of do anything to be profitable. You cut corners, you treat people poorly. It's the bottom line is king. And then as a mea culpa, you go and you give dollars to some charity as an amends for, the way you obtained your capital. And I'm not saying that that's in some corners, that's the way it's viewed. I would challenge that to say you can be incredibly generous and philanthropic in the way you earn, just the same as the way you give. Really, the only difference in your pursuit and your focus is the way that it's taxed by our system. Meaning the way you give, that's tax. You get a tax benefit if you do that. But really, the focus should be the same in the earning and the giving. It's providing value. It's leaving people better than you found them, so on and so forth. So one example of that, I'll actually give two, but on the Brian Don story, one of the things that Jamie's so good at, better than anybody that I've ever seen, and it's natural to her, that not only did she communicate and send a letter to Brian, but Brian had mentioned in our meeting who he learned from. And so what Jamie actually did is she wrote a long handwritten note and sent it to Mr. Bonner, who at the time I think was in his late 80s, and sent a letter to him saying, thank you for mentoring and showing Brian the ropes. Because of your investment in him, he invested in us, and we have derived such tremendous benefit. We're grateful. So not only was it direct to him, but it was also direct to Mr. Bonner, who also had mentored and taught Brian quite a number of things over the years. So I just thought that was incredibly exceptional that she did that. It meant a lot to Mr. Bonner, who's now passed, but it also meant a lot to Brian. It was just the right thing to do. But anyway, so as to kind of expound on what Jamie said with regards to generous giving and organization, that really cultivates community and conversation. It's not prescriptive, doesn't tell you how to give, where to give, and to what extent. But one of the things that's come out of that, and Jamie's actually been really instrumental in this, is she's formed these giving groups. So it could be ladies, 12 ladies, 12 guys, 6 couples, but generally 12 people. And there's different buy-ins per group depending on capability, but we're involved in a number of them. But in short, you have 12 people that meet twice a year. It's kind of a board, a giving board. And there's usually, let's say, $2,500 a person to be a part of the group, right? So it's $30,000 a year. There's a donor advised fund that can be set up that can aggregate the capital. But basically, you meet twice a year and you determine who the recipient is, local. And usually you want to give locally, so there's a point of connection. And so any member of the 12 can bring a story, a person, or a situation to the group. The group then talks about it, decides on it, and then decides to fund $15,000 or $30,000 or whatever portion of that $30,000 a year that's budgeted per group. It's a really great way to build community and to also give locally in a pretty powerful way. So one really quick story is we have landscapers that we use in Orlando at our house. A gentleman's a dear friend. He's an ex-con who only employs ex-cons. And I love him for that. He's one of my favorite people. And so we have let him know if he has anybody in his community that ever has an issue to bring them to us. Because one of the things we're really, as we seek to extend our social fabric upward and onward, because that's kind of the context of this conversation, we also want to make sure that we're extending our social fabric to others that may not have our connections. So we, with a call, can solve a problem with somebody else that would be very difficult in some cases for them to solve. So this gentleman brought a lady to us who, her husband, in short, her dad died. She got back from burying her dad. Her husband left her. She has 4 kids, and then her car broke. So those 3 events in the same month left her homeless, functionally homeless. She was living in a 1-bedroom hotel that was really seedy, and her 4 kids were there. So in short, this landscaper friend of ours brought this lady to us and said, she's a dear lady. She's really sweet. She's worth helping. And so Jamie and I basically presented her to the group. And in short, she was paying almost $2,000 a month to live in a seedy hotel, weekly rental. It was horrible. And so we were able to help them obtain, Jamie did a lot on this, but helped her obtain a mobile home. So we contributed the amount of capital needed to put her down payment down on a brand new mobile home, helped move her into a mobile home park right around the corner from our house. One of the members in the group also bought her a car so that her car wouldn't break down again, so that she could get transportation to work and not have that risk in her in her model. We took her kids, picked up her kids, took them to school supply shop, got them everything they needed for the school year, invited them over to parties at the house and just events to try to integrate ourselves into their lives and them into our lives. So it's one great story. The net result is she went from $2,000 a month for just a terrible condition to almost $700 a month and lives in a 3-2 her own home. So that was a story. That was one of many stories that come out of these giving groups. And so it's just fun to see.
Yeah, I like that, especially because a lot of this conversation, to your point, has been focused on, kind of the other side of the spectrum, trying to not be the smartest person in the room, trying to identify relationships where you can aspire to be. But I think a really important part of this conversation also is giving the opportunity for others, to mentor the next generation, basically, in a variety of different ways. And I can tell you from personal experience, I certainly had several very influential people in my career that without them, I truly don't know where I would be professionally. And now, as my sphere of influence has increased and has my network has increased, I'm now in the position to be able to help other people out with their career. And that is an incredibly powerful position and something that I'm incredibly honored by. And it's so much more meaningful than going around trying to find what you can get out of other people's relationships. I think that a lot of people make the mistake of going to these networking events where they're basically there to spray and pray with their business cards and just find people that they can build some kind of strategic relationship with, only for the point of building that strategic relationship with. But not only will you get much more out of these relationships if you go in trying to give, you're going to live a much more meaningful life. So that's definitely one of the reoccurring themes in a lot of these stories. So I appreciate you going into that level of detail. Definitely glad we asked that question. One of the other things that I wanted to discuss with you is, being regarding sphere of influence in particular. Jamie, I know that you authored a book that, in fact, my attorney, prior to us even knowing each other, my attorney has read and sent to me later saying, oh, by the way, I've read Jamie's book. So I wanted to know if, kind of some of your key takeaways in that experience, and if you are interested in doing something like that again, and would you suggest other people that are interested in being, a person of influence in their particular sector pursue that?
Yeah, I think writing a book is an excellent experience. I had never really participated in something like that before. So I would also say, in full transparency, it was much more difficult than I would have ever anticipated in terms of what goes into it. But I thought it was a very helpful process in terms of communicating concretely and concisely on certain subjects and really thinking how you can help someone else. So the concept of the book was really demand-based. So over the years, when Ryan and I had built a business, and like we kind of talked about at the top of the call, we started and, we built it layer by layer, piece by piece. And in the beginning, like Ryan said, a lot of folks, they were just more or less bystanders, or thought, well, gosh, hope that works out. Never heard of anybody investing in mobile home parks before. Right. And were a bit skeptical about it, and probably reasonably so. And so in the beginning, there was that sort of element in terms of talking to people about it. And then as we built over time and gained momentum, the questions changed more or less to, well, how did you do it? In the beginning, it was, why would you do this? The educational process that was associated with it. But then it became quickly, how did you build this? How did you start with single family homes? And then you went into mobile home parks, and then now you have a portfolio of them. And so it was really, the book was born out of response to the demand or those types of questions. So I think that was also helpful in putting the content into one place, because as Ryan and I would answer those questions in a one-off basis, or we would answer them in a large setting at an event or as a guest speaker at some sort of educational environment, we really just took that content that we were sharing and those questions that we were answering to help folks get started and build their business, and also avoid a lot of the experiences that we had that were costly or time consuming, and try to narrow it down so the path for someone that wanted to emulate what we had done could have a much more efficient process. So I think, to really answer your question, it is definitely something that I would do again. Ryan and I are actually in the process of updating the book, because we've done so much since then. We've talked about how there would be a lot of value add in taking it from where we last stop when we concluded writing this particular book to where we are now. There's a lot more that's been done that could also be useful and helpful to others. So, and in terms of the part of the question that was, would I recommend someone else doing that? I think if someone has something unique to say and they want to share it, then absolutely it adds value. It's certainly, and I know the nature of this conversation today is talking about relationship building. It's just another valuable point of connection. So like you said, your attorney had read the book. I run into people all over that have read the book or send me emails. And so there's a lot of opportunity to build relationships that way. So it can, again, create another bridge. So to answer that part of it for someone else, if they want to create another bridge and they've got something unique and valuable to share, I can't see why someone would not want to do it, especially in the environment today where it's a little bit easier to write books and publish them than it would have been 20, 30 years ago.
Certainly. And you're just increasing the number of touches that you can have on a potential relationship. So, if you're meeting them in person, that's one. If you have a book in their office, that's two. And you're just adding that number of the senses that can be touched. It really facilitates that much more quickly. After you have created a lot of these relationships, do you have a system or even suggestions for people in terms of following up and nurturing those relationships over the years? Is it something that is relationship dependent? Is it basically organic? Or do you have something more systematized to make sure that you are maintaining those relationships? Because I have found that following up, or at least staying in touch, is really when the value starts to be derived for both parties.
I agree. I would say it depends on the nature of the relationship you seek to have and the person you're connecting with. So to me, there are people that I meet occasionally that I'm just from a distance and immediately I'm blown away by them. So 2 weeks ago, I was in New York and there's a guy I got to connect with. We had good conversation. I'm just amazed at what he has done and how he has done it. So I may go about it a different way with him than somebody where it's not as clear where everything is, who they are, what they do, how I can add value. So there's different categories. So for what I would define as potential key relationships or, people like Brian, Don, and others, those are usually very personal, organic. So we don't try to implement any kind of drip email campaign or,
Right.
anything programmatic. It's all handwritten notes, which Jamie does prolifically. And she's really good at it. But the point is handwritten notes, in-person meetings, dinners, if you can. But it just depends on, to me, the type of person you're looking to connect with. But generally the higher profile people, usually face-to-face, personal, is probably the better way to go. But Jamie may have different feedback.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think, Hunter, it's very valuable what you're saying. The follow-up is key because there's no point in making a ton of contacts or engaging with a whole, variety of folks if you don't really have an intentional follow-up process in place. But I do agree definitely with what Ryan said. It depends on the nature of the relationship. If it's a relationship of which there are many, there's certainly relationship software programs that people can use. And depending on the nature of their business, there's updates and content that can be provided that provides a consistent touch. So that would be more or less a broad relationship. But the more closely held or higher level relationships, Ryan and I are very big on face-to-face if possible or when possible. So being specific and intentional about when that could be scheduled, and also always being considerate of the person's time on both sides of it. You value your time and you value their time. So that has to make sense. But we make it a point to be in person when we can. And whether it's a follow-up phone call or follow-up email or a handwritten note, which as Ryan highlighted, I like to do that. And especially in a digital age, I have found the response to just a simple handwritten note really disproportionate to the effort. Meaning for me, it's not that hard to do. It really doesn't take that long. But because we are in such a digital age and people don't do it nearly as often as they once did, when someone does receive something like that, I do think it stands out a little bit more some other type of communication. But I would say, having said that some communication is better than none.
Yep.
Certainly.
The only other thing I would add is to encourage your listener too on what we would define as key relationships. It takes really one or two. You don't need a litany of them. You don't need a large number of, one or there's a book that Jamie and I read years ago called The Power of Two. But when you look at successful entrepreneurs and businesses, there's usually two. Like Warren Buffett, there's Charlie Munger.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take away Charlie, things would be different. And, Steve Jobs and Woz, and there's many examples of this. So I would also encourage, as far as key relationships go, you don't need 100, you don't need 10, one or two will do to really propel you, I think, in many cases forward. So it's more quality than quantity in that regard.
Great point. It's very hard to facilitate a lot of those relationships because the nature of those relationships are that they are key, meaning that they are meaningful. Then so you can't just scale that. That's the whole point, including the conversation regarding thank you notes. I completely agree with that. I don't write handwritten thank you notes because my handwriting is not nearly as good as I'm assuming Jamie's is. But I will say that investing the time, it is probably the best professional investment you can make as a business owner to take the time, take the resources to send thank you notes. Send them for referrals, send them to new investors. You will see the $1 or $3 or whatever it takes to send gifts and send thank you notes to people that have helped you out in some way. The overwhelming ROI is pretty much unachievable any other way. And I can tell by this conversation that you guys agree with that. So I'm not even going to open that up for questions. So, I want to be respectful of your time. I know that we're coming up on the top of the hour. Are there any other tips that you want to share with the listeners? We've covered a lot of ground, but is there anything else that comes to mind regarding facilitating relationships, maintaining relationships, et cetera?
I think the two things that I would mention, and Jamie could probably build them out better than I could, but I think the why you're seeking to connect is far more important than the how you're seeking to connect, because how is more tactical or strategic, or should I join a group? Should I go to this event? But I think once you're there, the why you want to connect with a person, and I think is incredibly important. And what we have found for both Jamie and I is we're usually just naturally, I guess, organically, we like people. I'm personally amazed at what people do in ways that they innovate and in ways that they're gifted and find their own path. So I find myself really curious when I meet people. So I generally ask a lot of questions because I want to know more about them, what makes them tick. And by the way, it's definitely not an interrogation, but the point is I'm interested in learning about that person. So I would definitely focus on the why you're seeking to connect and then implement the how. But I think the why is really critical. And then I think the need to create genuine connections rather than programmatic connections or ones that are created through strategy or some kind of tactical analysis. Our relationships have been really organic and natural and kind of freely formed and mutually beneficial. And so I think that's partially because we're just really curious about the people we meet, what makes them them. And I think that's been a good basis for conversation and getting to know people. Because I think at the end of the day, when you meet a person, you don't know what you can offer them and you don't know what that person may offer you because you really don't know. So you don't want to be a hammer where everything's a nail, where you say, I need this. And it's, are you my mother? Are you my mother? Just kind of go into each person
Right.
looking for that one thing. So the way we go, we go in, we say, tell me about yourself, where you're from, if there's context to the local, where they're from that we may, restaurant or things we've been to. Anyway, we're just curious. And then over time, you find ways that you can add value to that person in ways that possibly might add value to what you're doing. But I don't think you know that up front. So I think just being curious, exploratory, wanting to know about them, I think is grounds for getting there eventually.
Absolutely. And Jamie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with what he shared. I think it's really important. And Ryan is terrific at those things, especially because he is just naturally curious and people gravitate towards him. He's interested in them and a natural dialogue takes place and relationships are built really organically and naturally. So I think he made great points. I thought one thing as I was just thinking on the overall concept of the call, and there's something that I used to hear a lot growing up. I don't hear it as much anymore, but some of your listeners may be familiar with the phrase, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. And I used to remember thinking as a kid, well, gosh, I don't really know anybody. Like, I don't know that many people. So when we're talking about building relationships and having contacts and how that works and can grow, if someone's in a position where, maybe they're changing fields or they're changing sectors or they're building something new and they don't necessarily have the people that they think they should know in that specific space, I think something that's always served us very well is we've just started moving. So we have been in a position where we knew where we wanted to go. We started creating momentum. We started taking action. And what I can say I've seen over the last 20 years is that momentum has created an energy which has drawn in folks. And so suddenly you realize that you have built meaningful relationships with people where you can be mutually beneficial to one another in a very healthy and natural way. So, and I think that is born out of, you take action, you create momentum, you become useful not only to yourself, but you become useful to others. And naturally, those relationships will grow from there. And you have a network of resources just in that.
Awesome. Well, we have covered a ton of ground. There's so many interesting key takeaways from this. I think one of the main things that is reoccurring through the conversation is that giving and focusing on how you can provide value to others is going to open you up to a completely different world when it comes to really facilitating the relationships. There's one individual that comes to mind in my career that's really good at identifying the things that I personally like about myself and complimenting on those. That one suggestion will completely forever facilitate a long-term relationship. And so there's many, many things we can go into here, but either way, Ryan and Jamie, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's obviously an interesting conversation. I know it's not something that you have typically presented on, even though you've done more than 100 events, but thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
All right, listeners, thanks for checking out the episode. As always, the contact information for our guest will be available in the show notes page, which is hosted on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher. Don't forget, if you want access to some of the free goodies that I'm talking about at the beginning of these episodes, like free ebooks, weekly investor emails, and articles about some of the most important investment-related topics, make sure that you have created an account with CFC because this stuff is automatically available. You can do this by going to cashflowconnections.com and signing up as an accredited investor. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at hunterthompson@cashflowconnections.com.